Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a really pivotal and, well, still debated moment in history, the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, often called the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Now, in the West, this is often painted as, a pretty self-serving act, a real black mark on the Soviet Union's record.
Absolutely. And what we're going to try and do today is really get under the skin of the Soviet perspective on this agreement. We've got a compelling source here that argues this wasn't about any shared ideology, not at all, but cold, hard strategic calculation. It definitely challenges some of the traditional narratives we often hear.
Exactly. And to really get this Soviet viewpoint, we kind of have to set the stage, don't we? Think about the lead up to World War II. The moves, and arguably just as important, the lack of moves by the major Western powers.
Yeah, our source highlights a few key pillars supporting the Soviet rationale here. We're looking at the West's apparent unwillingness, or maybe inability, to seriously confront Hitler early on. Also, the unraveling of attempts to build like a unified front against aggression. And then there's this growing sense in Moscow that they were facing a dangerous threat largely on their own.
Okay, so let's unpack this, maybe starting with how the source itself frames the common understanding of this pact.
Right. Yeah, the source doesn't really pull any punches, does it? It directly labels the standard Western take on the Soviet role in the war, and especially the pact's significance. Well, it calls it a distorted representation, even a historical injustice. That's quite a strong starting point. What's the driving force behind that claim? Well, the core of the argument, it really rests on the staggering sacrifices made by the Soviet Union in ultimately defeating Nazi Germany. The source emphasizes the 27 million lives lost. I mean, just an almost unimaginable number. The contention is that by hyper-focusing on this non-aggression pact, the West conveniently, perhaps, downplays its own earlier missteps. And, the sheer scale of the Soviet contribution to the Allied victory, it's almost as if the pact becomes a way to sort of avoid a deeper look at the West's own pre-war strategies.
Hmm. So the pact is presented less as a starting point for understanding the war and more as a kind of smokescreen. Is that fair?
Precisely. That's the suggestion. The source argues that the narrative around the pact is misused to deflect attention from the earlier policies of the Western democracies. And look, those policies are absolutely critical if you want to grasp the Soviet perspective here.
Okay, let's dig into those Western actions then,
Yeah.
or as you said, inactions. What specific examples does the source highlight?
Well, a key early one is Germany's remilitarization of the Rhineland. That was back in 1936. This was a clear breach of the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that put strict limits on Germany's military after World War I. Yet, despite having the military capacity to respond, France chose not to act. And that sent a significant signal, didn't it, about the potential lack of resolve in the West to confront Hitler's growing ambitions.
Yeah, that does seem like a pretty early sign that maybe, just maybe, aggressive moves wouldn't be met with real force.
Exactly. Then you get the 1938 Munich Agreement, often seen as a real turning point. Czechoslovakia was essentially handed over to Hitler, right? And the Soviet Union, remember, they had a mutual defense treaty with Czechoslovakia. They weren't even invited to the negotiating table. Just think about that for a moment. A major European power with a treaty obligation completely sidelined.
Wow. Yeah, that must have sent a powerful message to Moscow about how they were viewed by the West and, well, the value of their alliances.
Undeniably. And the source also points out the rather uncomfortable fact that Poland and Hungary also participated in the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. Poland actually seized the Teschen region. Now, this would have further solidified the Soviet view that the West wasn't only unwilling to stand up to Hitler, but maybe also incapable of stopping other nations in Eastern Europe from pursuing their own interests amidst the growing chaos. It painted a picture of a fractured and perhaps quite self-serving Europe.
So the Soviet leadership, they likely saw a West that appeared, well, weak, indecisive, and ultimately looking out for its own interest, even at the expense of others.
That's the clear impression the source gives, yes.
Yeah.
And this context, it's crucial for understanding what happens next. The failed attempts to forge a collective security alliance.
Right, the negotiations between the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. This was in the months leading right up to the pact with Germany. What went wrong there, according to the source anyway?
The source points to a few critical issues. First, the British-French delegation. They arrived in Moscow quite late, which in itself might have signaled a lack of urgency. More importantly, they didn't actually possess the full authority to make binding commitments for their governments. And perhaps most significantly, they lacked concrete military proposals. The Soviets were looking for a firm, detailed commitment, joint military action if Germany attacked, and that's just not what was on offer.
It sounds like maybe the West wasn't really treating the Soviet offer of an alliance with the seriousness Moscow felt it deserved, especially given the escalating threat.
That's certainly the implication here. And then you have the major sticking point, the one that effectively derailed any potential agreement: Poland's firm refusal. They would not allow Soviet troops to cross their territory, even if it were to defend. Their own sovereignty.
That's a real catch-22, though, isn't it? Poland's understandable fear of the Soviets inadvertently undermining the very alliance that could have potentially protected it.
Precisely. So while these frustrating and ultimately, fruitless negotiations were dragging on, Germany comes along and presents the Soviet Union with a very different proposition.
A much more straightforward offer, and seemingly immediate.
Exactly. A non-aggression pact, negotiated and concluded with remarkable speed. And crucially, it included that secret protocol, the one outlining spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. So, faced with what they saw as the failure of the West to offer a credible security guarantee, coupled with this concrete offer from Germany, the source argues that the pact appeared to Moscow as a rational choice to buy time.
A pragmatic decision, then, though you could argue morally fraught, born out of a sense of isolation and a very real threat right on their border.
That's the central argument put forward by the source, yes. And this brings us to the Soviet entry into eastern Poland, September 1939, just after the German invasion.
Which, as we know, is still a deeply controversial aspect of this whole period. What's the justification offered for this action, according to the source?
Okay, so the official explanation, as presented here, was that the Polish state had effectively collapsed, in the wake of the German blitzkrieg. This supposedly created a power vacuum and a necessity to protect the populations in those eastern territories. However, the source also underscores a key strategic objective: to shift Soviet defensive lines westward. The thinking in Moscow, it seems, was to create a buffer zone to prevent a potential future conflict with Germany from being fought on Soviet soil itself.
Pushing their strategic depth further west, basically.
Precisely. And the source is careful to point out that the territories involved what largely corresponds to modern-day Western Ukraine and Western Belarus. These were historically part of the Russian Empire, and they had a predominantly Slavic population, Ukrainian or Belarusian, not ethnically Polish.
So it's framed more as reclaiming historically and ethnically linked lands rather than just a pure act of expansionism.
That's the narrative presented in the source, yes. It also notes that the Soviet advance stayed within the agreed-upon boundaries of that secret protocol with Germany, which suggests, from this perspective, a limited tactical operation rather than a full-scale war of conquest.
It's crucial to remember, though, isn't it, that regardless of this pact, the fundamental ideological divide between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was just immense.
Oh, absolutely. The source explicitly reminds us of Hitler's deep-seated hatred of communism. It's right there in Mein Kampf. He depicted the Soviet Union as a rotten Bolshevik construct, destined for destruction. And then there's the whole Nazi ideology of Jewish Bolshevism that further underscored this fundamental antagonism.
So it's highly unlikely, you'd have to think, that either side saw this pact as anything other than temporary, something dictated purely by immediate strategic needs.
Exactly. The source argues that Stalin was under no illusions at all. He understood that a future conflict with Germany was inevitable. The pact was a strategic delay, a pause. And why was that delay so important? Because, according to the source, the Soviet military in 1939, it just wasn't ready for a major war. It was in the middle of significant modernization, yes, but it had also been severely weakened by the purges of the officer corps in the years just before. So gaining time, any time, to strengthen their military capabilities was seen as absolutely critical.
Right. Buying precious time to prepare for an almost certain future fight seems to be a really central part of this Soviet-centric interpretation of the pact.
It really is. So, if we try to synthesize the source's argument, the Non-Aggression Pact wasn't about shared political aims. It wasn't a betrayal of broader European values from this viewpoint. It was rather a pragmatic, perhaps even desperate response, a response to a Western alliance that seemed unwilling or unable to effectively counter Hitler, and one that had, seemingly, dismissed Soviet attempts at forming a united front. The actions that followed in eastern Poland, they're presented as a strategic necessity for self-preservation in a highly precarious geopolitical landscape.
And the ultimate point, from this perspective, is that this highly controversial pact, however morally ambiguous it might appear in hindsight, it bought the Soviet Union the time and the strategic depth it needed to ultimately survive. And crucially, to play that enormous, albeit devastatingly costly role in the defeat of Nazi Germany.
Exactly. The source doesn't necessarily seek to justify the morality of the pact, you know? It's more about providing an explanation rooted in the perceived realities and the strategic calculations of the Soviet leadership during that exceptionally dangerous period. It really invites us, you, the listener, to consider the choices they believed they faced at that time.
So as we conclude this deep dive into the Soviet perspective on the Hitler-Stalin Pact, it really does prompt a bit of a reevaluation, doesn't it? Considering the almost unimaginable human cost borne by the Soviet Union in World War II, how does understanding their perceived rationale for the events leading up to it maybe reshape our overall understanding of the conflict and, the complex motivations of all the nations involved? It certainly underscores the intricate and often unsettling web of decisions that led to one of history's most devastating chapters. And it really encourages us all to continuously explore these pivotal events from multiple vantage points.